Good evening and welcome to 365 Days of Stories with Theo Mayer. Here we are on day 179, and I'm continuing the stories from 1001 Arabian Nights and the story of Amina. Now, remember, she had married this young man, and all had gone well for quite some time until the young man's mom, or Amina's now mother-in-law, had suggested that they go buy silks in the marketplace, silk to make garments. And so they went, and remember, the silk vendor, instead of giving her a kiss on the cheek, bit a piece of her cheek away. Now, her stepmother, or her mother-in-law, was very, very upset by this. Amina had fainted on the ground, and when she awakened, her mother-in-law hurried her away so other people wouldn't see what had happened. And they went home to the house, and her mother-in-law suggested she get into bed and pretend that she was sick. Now, she was hurting desperately, and she put ointments and powders on the wound, but it was very, very painful. And when her husband got home, he went to her room and asked her how she was doing. She said she wasn't feeling well at all. And he came up to her and looked her in the face and said, "What is the matter, and what has happened to you?" And at first she said that a wood seller whose camel was laden with wood had brushed up against her in a narrow alleyway and torn her veil and wounded her cheek. And he said, "Oh, if that's the case, I will go to Jafar and have every camel driver in the city executed." And she said, No, please don't do that. Don't put the guilt of death upon me for such a thing. And he said, "Then tell me, what is it that really happened?" And she said, "Well, we rented a donkey, and the donkey threw me, and I ended up hitting a piece of glass in the road." And her husband began to get angry because he didn't believe a word that she was saying. Well, she came with one excuse after another, and of course he knew none of them were true. And she was just so afraid of telling him the truth, afraid of his anger and what he might do, and the vow that she had made to not look upon another man. It's so strange, but her mother-in-law perpetrated this whole situation for her. And now look at what was happening. Well, he began to curse her and say very, very mean things to her. And, well, she returned with equally as cruel things to say to him. And he was telling her that she was unfaithful and obviously had gone and visited with another man, and she had complained basically in her words that he was the one that was faithless, that she had committed herself to him, and that he knew nothing of what love was, because if he did, he would know that she loved him. And anyway, their banter went back and forth until he got very, very angry. And he called a number of his slaves into him, and he had two of them hold her down, and another one, he told the other one to cut her in half, and I'll throw the two halves of her into the Tigris River, and even though it shall make me miserable, it's better than this. Well, at that point in time, the mother-in-law rushed into the room, and she begged her son not to do this heinous act. And he wouldn't listen. And on now the argument went between the mother-in-law and him. And finally she said, "What are you even spending time with this worthless woman for anyway? Leave her alone and get on with your life." Now, why couldn't she have just told the truth? I don't understand, but perhaps in those days and in those times, this vow that Amina had had to make to her husband was very, very important. Well, he said, "Fine, I will let her go, but I will have to leave my mark upon her." And he then took a rod and began to beat her sides and her neck until there were welts there and she had passed out. And then he had his slaves carry her by the direction of the mother-in-law to her house, and there they left her. She did not wake up until the next morning. And now remember, she's telling all this to Harun al-Rashid, the caliph. Well, she finally awakened, and she treated her body as best she could with ointments and powders. I mean, what a horrible thing to be treated in such a way, and treated as if she was a possession of a man. And know that this was how things went in those days and in those places of the world. And remember, who is telling this story? But Scheherazade herself. And why is she doing so? You might remember, to keep the Sultan from having a new bride each night. Well, Amina spent 4 months in recovery. And finally, when she did recover, she went off in search of her husband. She went back to the alleyway to find him. When she got there, she was amazed because all of the houses along that alleyway had been destroyed. The home that she had lived in with her husband, it was gone. And his place was just piles of rubble. She knew not what else to do. She turned and left, and she sought the company of her sister, her half-sister, her sister on her father's side, the sister that, well, the daughter that her father had had before her, who was Zubaydah. And Amina told her entire story to Zubaydah, and Zubaydah, well, she could hardly believe it. She said, "It seems ill luck follows us all at some point." Now, by this time, Zubaydah had her 2 sisters with her. Not as sisters as we would know them, but as the black dogs. And then Amina said all was well, and things continued to go as they went until the night that Sadie came home with a porter. And a quarter way into the evening, well, the calendar showed up, and then a third of the way into the evening, these 3 merchants from Mosul showed up. And then they did not do what we had asked them to do, the one condition that we had set for them, but we heard their stories and set them free. And then in the morning, Commander of the Faithful, we were summoned to come here. That is my story, she said. Well, Harun al-Rashid, after he had heard all this, and what a tale, he just was taking it all in. He said, turning to Zubaydah, he said, "Do you know what happened to the serpent? What happened, and when is she coming back to meet with you?" And Zubaydah said, "I do not know where she went, but she did give me a tuft of hair and said if I ever needed her, to take 2 of those hairs and to burn them, and she would appear immediately, no matter how far away she was. Well, the Caliph, Harun al-Rashid, the commander of the faithful, asked, "And where is that tuft of hair?" And we'll stop the story there. Find out what happens next. Okay, thanks for joining. Have a good rest of your day or evening, whatever it may be.